Imagine, for a moment, that you wake up tomorrow and everything is exactly the same. The alarm goes off at the same time. The light comes through the window at the same angle. You reach for your phone with the same hand in the same half-conscious motion, and you see the same notifications you saw this morning. You have breakfast and it tastes the same because it is the same breakfast, molecule for molecule, moment for moment. You go to work or you don't. You say the same things to the same people. You make the same joke that lands the same way, gets the same laugh, the same half-second of silence right after. You feel the same flicker of doubt you always feel around 3 p.m., the one you've never told anyone about. You go home. You eat dinner. You lie in bed and think the thought you think most nights, the one about whether any of this is going anywhere, and then you fall asleep. And then you wake up, and it happens again. Not a similar day. Not a day that rhymes with yesterday. The same day. Down to the angle of the light, down to the flicker of doubt at 3 p.m., down to the thought you think right before sleep. And when that day ends, it doesn't lead to tomorrow. It leads back to itself. It happens again. And again. Not for a while. Not for a long time. Forever. Every conversation you've ever had, every mistake, every heartbreak, every stretch of grey, forgettable Tuesday, every single ordinary hour you've spent scrolling through nothing in particular, all of it, exactly as it happened, repeating without end, without variation, without escape. Somewhere in that thought something in you recoils. And somewhere else in that thought, if you sit with it long enough, something in you goes very quiet, because the question underneath it isn't really about physics or time loops or the structure of the universe. The question is about you. It's asking whether the life you're living right now, this one, the actual one, not the one you plan to live someday when things are different, is a life you could stand to have again. And again. And again, without end. This is the thought experiment a philosopher named Friedrich Nietzsche once described as the heaviest weight that could ever be placed on a human life. He didn't mean it as a metaphor. He meant weight the way you'd mean it if someone handed you something and your knees buckled. He wrote it in a book called The Gay Science, in a short passage near the end, and he wrote it as a scene. A demon slips into your loneliest hour, into the moment when you are most alone with yourself, and it tells you that this life, the one you are living now, you will have to live again and again, countless times more, and there will be nothing new in it. Every pain, every joy, every thought, every sigh, all the unspeakably small and great things in your life will return to you in the same succession and sequence, even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, even this moment, and even the demon that is telling you this. The eternal hourglass of existence, he wrote, is turned over again and again, and you with it, a speck of dust. And then the demon asks you a question. Not would you like this to be true? Not does this frighten you? The demon asks, how would you respond? Would you curse the demon that told you this? Would you throw yourself to the ground and grind your teeth? Or would there come a moment, has there ever come a moment in your whole life when you could answer the demon, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? That's the thought experiment. That's the whole of it, in its original shape, before anyone tried to turn it into a scientific claim or a self-help slogan. A demon, a whisper, a question about how you would respond to your own life, offered back to you exactly as it was, forever. Before we go anywhere else with this, it's worth sitting in that scene a little longer, because most people who have heard of eternal recurrence have heard it second-hand, flattened into a single idea. What if everything repeats forever, without ever really being asked the follow-up question, which is the actual point? Nietzsche wasn't trying to describe the universe. He was trying to describe you. He was building a mirror, and the mirror was cruel on purpose because he didn't trust comfortable mirrors to tell the truth. Think about what the demon is actually offering. Not a better version of your life. Not a curated highlight reel. Not the parts you'd keep if you were editing the footage down to the moments you're proud of. Everything. The argument you had with your father that you still haven't resolved. The years you spent chasing something that turned out to be hollow. The night you said the thing you can't take back. The friendships that dissolved for reasons you still don't fully understand. The body you've complained about in the mirror more mornings than you've thanked it. The version of yourself you're a little embarrassed by, the one from 5 years ago or 5 months ago or this morning. All of it, unedited, unforgiven, unrepentant, coming back exactly as it was, over and over, without end, and without any promise that it adds up to anything or goes anywhere or gets resolved. No final chapter. No moral. No arc bending toward justice or meaning. Just recurrence. Just the same loop, closing on itself, endlessly. Most people's first reaction, when they actually let themselves feel the weight of that, is horror. Not mild discomfort horror. Because most of us are quietly living our lives on the assumption that the bad parts are temporary. That the mediocre stretch you're in right now is just a stretch, a chapter, something you'll look back on from somewhere better. That the version of you making these particular mistakes is a draft, and the final version is still coming. Eternal recurrence takes that assumption and closes the door on it. There is no draft. There is no eventual better version waiting in the wings. There is only this exact life, lived exactly this way, happening again and again and again. And here's the thing that makes the thought experiment work, the thing that makes it more than just a nightmare scenario. Nietzsche wasn't asking whether you could survive that. He wasn't asking whether you could tolerate it, or resign yourself to it, or grit your teeth and get through it one more time like gritting your teeth through a rerun. He was asking something much harder. He was asking whether you could want it, whether you could stand in front of your whole life, every part of it, the parts you're proud of and the parts you'd erase if you could, and say yes. Not a resigned yes. Not a yes wrung out of you by exhaustion. A yes that sounds like the demon just handed you the best news you've ever heard. That's the real question underneath the cosmology. Before we get into whether Nietzsche thought this could actually be physically true, and he did flirt with that more seriously than most people realize, it's worth staying here for a while, in the emotional center of the thought experiment, because this is where it actually does its work on a person. Not in the physics. In the mirror. So let's ask it plainly, the way the demon would ask it, without softening it. If you had to live this exact life again, not a better one, not an edited one, this one, would you? Think about your actual week. Not the week you'll have once things calm down, once the situation resolves, once you get the thing you're waiting for. This week. The one you're in the middle of right now. The commute that drains something out of you before the day even starts. The relationship that's fine, mostly, except for the parts that aren't, the parts you've stopped mentioning because mentioning them doesn't seem to change anything. The job that pays the bills and asks for more of you than it gives back. The hours you lose to your phone, scrolling past things you won't remember by tomorrow, spending your one and only attention on content designed to be forgotten. The dreams you had 5 years ago that you've quietly stopped mentioning, not because you gave up on them exactly, but because saying them out loud started to feel like admitting how far you drifted from them. Would you sign up for that again? Forever. Exactly as it is, with no edits. Most people, asked that question honestly, feel something drop in their stomach. Not because their lives are catastrophic. Most lives aren't catastrophes. Most lives are something quieter and in some ways harder to face, mildly disappointing, slightly smaller than what was promised, full of decent moments and low-grade resignation, threaded through with a sense that you're waiting for something, for Friday, for the weekend, for the promotion, for the relationship to get easier, for the diet to work, for the money to stop being tight, for real life to start. And the demon's question strips all of that waiting away. There is no once this part is over. There is no next chapter. There is only the loop, and you're already in it, and it's already repeating. This is why Nietzsche called it the heaviest weight. Not because it's sad, because it removes the exits. It removes the fantasy that your current dissatisfaction is temporary, that you're just passing through a rough patch on the way to somewhere better. It forces you to evaluate your life as a finished object, complete and closed, rather than a project still in progress with the good parts presumably still ahead. And most of us, if we're honest, have been quietly living as if the good parts are still ahead. We tell ourselves a story where the present moment is provisional, a placeholder, a means to an end, something to get through on the way to the life we're actually trying to build. Eternal Recurrence takes that story and asks, what if this is the whole story? What if there is no getting through? What if this is it, on repeat, forever? Now, before we go further into what that question is really asking of you, it's worth taking a detour through where the idea came from, because Nietzsche didn't invent it out of nowhere, and understanding its lineage tells you something important about what kind of idea it actually is. The notion that time might not be a straight line, that the universe might loop rather than march forward toward some final destination, is much older than Nietzsche, and it shows up in cultures that had very little contact with each other. Ancient Indian cosmology describes vast cycles of creation and dissolution, kalpas stretching across unimaginable spans, the universe breathing in and out across eons, without a single beginning or a single end. Certain schools of ancient Greek thought, particularly among the Stoics, described a cosmic cycle in which the universe would eventually be consumed in a great conflagration and then reborn, playing out again in exactly the same way down to the smallest detail, the same people living the same lives, making the same choices, because the causal chain that produced them the first time would produce them again under identical conditions. The Pythagoreans reportedly held something similar. In a linear, forward-marching view of time, the kind that Western culture largely inherited through Christianity, with its story of creation, fall, redemption, and final judgment, history has a direction and a destination. In a psychical view, history has neither. It just recurs. Nietzsche was aware of this older lineage, and there's evidence in his notebooks that he took the idea seriously not just as a psychological thought experiment but as a possible physical fact about reality. His reasoning, sketched out in unpublished notes rather than fully developed in his published work, went roughly like this: if the universe contains a finite amount of matter and energy, and if time extends infinitely into the future, then the number of possible configurations of that matter and energy is finite, while the amount of time available for those configurations to occur is infinite. Given infinite time and finite possible states, every state must eventually recur not once but infinitely many times. Shuffle a deck of cards infinitely many times and every possible ordering will eventually come up again, and then again, and then again, forever. If the universe is like that deck, then the current configuration of everything, including you, including this exact moment, is not a one-time event. It has already happened before infinitely many times, and it will happen again infinitely many times more. It's worth saying clearly, this is not a claim that most physicists today would treat as established science. It rests on assumptions about the finitude of physical states and the infinitude of time that are, at minimum, contested, and Nietzsche himself never published a rigorous defense of it. It remained, for the most part, a private preoccupation scattered across notebooks he didn't intend for publication in that form. Some later commentators have argued he took it more seriously as literal cosmology than his admirers like to admit. Others have argued that what mattered to him was never really the physics at all, but the emotional and ethical weight the idea carries regardless of whether it's literally true. That second reading is the one that has aged best, and it's the one worth taking seriously here, because it turns out the thought experiment does its work on you whether or not the universe actually loops. Here's why that matters. If eternal recurrence were only a cosmological hypothesis, a claim about the literal structure of time and matter, then it would be interesting the way a physics puzzle is interesting, and you could set it aside once you decided whether you found the argument convincing. But that's not the register Nietzsche wrote it in. He wrote it as a scene with a demon in your loneliest tower. He wrote it as a test. And a test doesn't require the scenario to be literally true in order to be useful. It requires you to imagine it seriously enough that it changes how you see your actual life. Think of it like this: imagine someone asked you, if you had to relive today, would you be satisfied? You don't need to believe in time loops to feel the force of that question. You don't need a physics degree to notice that your gut has an answer before your mind has finished processing the words. The imaginative exercise does the work regardless of its metaphysical status. Nietzsche understood this. That's why he framed the idea not as a scientific proposition to be evaluated, but as a criterion, a way of testing whether you are living a life you actually affirm, or a life you are merely tolerating while you wait for something else to begin. He called the ideal response to this test Amor Fati, love of fate, not acceptance of fate, which is a much smaller and colder thing. Not resignation to fate, gritting your teeth and enduring what can't be changed. Love. He wrote in a passage that reads almost like a personal vow, that he wanted to learn to see as beautiful what is necessary in things, and in this way become one of those who make things beautiful. He wanted, he said, to be a yes-sayer. Not someone who waged war against what is ugly, but someone whose only negation was to look away from it. Looking away, he said, should be his only form of negation. That's a strange and demanding standard, and it's worth pausing on how different it is from simply staying positive. Amor Fati is not the philosophy of pretending things are fine when they aren't. It is not gratitude journaling. It is not toxic positivity dressed up in German. Nietzsche was not a naive optimist. He suffered enormously across most of his adult life from migraines so severe they left him bedridden for days at a time, from digestive illness, from near blindness, from a profound and repeated loneliness that shows up again and again in his letters, from professional failure, from a mental collapse in his mid-40s that ended his productive life a decade before his death. He was not a man cheerfully skipping through a pain-free existence, telling everyone else to look on the bright side. He was a man in genuine, chronic, often unbearable suffering, trying to figure out whether it was possible to affirm a life that contained that suffering, not despite the suffering, but including it as a real part of the whole that he was being asked to say yes to. This is the detail that changes everything about how you should read the Eternal Recurrence, and it's the detail most casual retellings of Nietzsche leave out entirely. He was not proposing Amor Fati from a position of comfort, asking others to make peace with difficulties he himself hadn't faced. He arrived at the idea from inside genuine devastation. The Eternal Recurrence was first written down during a period in his life, the early 1880s, that also produced some of his loneliest personal letters, written not long after a painful and humiliating rejection by a woman named Lucilla May, whom he had proposed to and who had turned him down, an episode that left him, by his own account, in one of the darkest periods of his life. He wrote about the idea coming to him almost like a revelation. On a walk near a lake in Switzerland beside a large pyramidal rock, he describes the moment with something close to religious intensity, 6,000 feet beyond man and time, as he put it. And it's precisely because it emerged from that place, from inside real suffering rather than outside it, that the challenge has any teeth at all. If a person who had never suffered told you to love your fate, you'd be forgiven for dismissing it as easy for them to say. Nietzsche doesn't give you that exit. So the question the Eternal Recurrence is really asking isn't a comfortable one, and it doesn't come with an easy answer built in. It's not, could you tolerate a good life repeating? Almost anyone could say yes to that. The real question is harder and stranger. Could you say yes to a life that includes its actual suffering, not suffering in general, in the abstract, but your specific suffering, the exact shape of it, the humiliations you remember at 2 a.m., the grief that never fully closed, the years that felt wasted, the relationship that ended badly and left a mark you still carry? Could you want all of that back, not because you've made peace with it in some vague sense, but because you can look at the whole of your life, this specific unrepeatable arrangement of joy and pain, and call it good? Not good despite the pain. Good as a whole that includes the pain as one of its necessary threads. This is where most people, encountering the idea honestly for the first time, start to feel a kind of resistance rise up, and the resistance is worth taking seriously rather than arguing past. because there's an obvious objection sitting right at the center of this, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than smooth over. Some suffering doesn't seem like something anyone should have to affirm. Abuse. Trauma inflicted by someone else's cruelty. Illness that steals decades from a person for no reason and to no purpose. A child's death. The kind of suffering that doesn't teach anyone anything, doesn't build character, doesn't become a beautiful thread in a beautiful tapestry. It just hurts senselessly, and asking someone to say yes to that, to want it back forever on repeat, can start to sound less like liberation and more like something close to cruelty itself. If you've lived through something like that, you may be listening to this and feeling a very reasonable anger at the suggestion that you should learn to love it. This objection deserves to be taken seriously rather than argued away, because it points to something true. Not every philosophy that sounds beautiful survived contact with the worst things that actually happen to people. And it's worth being honest that Nietzsche's own formulation can sound, at its most extreme, like it's asking for something inhuman, a total, unconditional yes to literally everything, including things that never should have happened, including harm inflicted by people who deserve blame rather than acceptance. But there's a way to hold the idea that doesn't require that kind of totalizing surrender, and it's closer, probably, to what Nietzsche was actually reaching for than the most extreme readings suggest. The point of the thought experiment was never really to produce a checklist where you go through every event of your life and individually approve of it, the way you'd approve line items on an expense report. That's not how affirmation works, and it's not how Nietzsche talks about it when he's being most careful. The point is closer to this: your life is not a collection of separable events that you could pull apart and keep some while discarding others. It's a single, woven thing. The friendships you cherish exist in the same fabric as the losses that shaped who you became capable of being a friend to anyone at all. The strength you have now, if you have any, was very often forged in exactly the fires you wish you could go back and prevent. Pull one thread out of the tapestry, and you're not left with the same tapestry minus one thread. You're left with a different tapestry, woven by a different person, because the person doing the reweighing wouldn't exist in quite the same form without the thread they're trying to remove. This is sometimes called, by later interpreters of Nietzsche, the idea of existential interconnectedness, the notion that a life is not a sum of independent parts that can be individually accepted or rejected, but an integrated whole, where even the events you most wish hadn't happened are load-bearing structures in the architecture of who you are now. To ask whether you'd want your whole life back with all of it intact is not the same as being asked to declare that every individual event was good or justified or deserved. It's being asked whether you can hold the totality, the whole shape of your becoming, including its wounds, and find, somewhere in that totality, something you would not trade away entirely, because trading it away would mean trading away yourself. That's a very different question than was your suffering good, and it's worth sitting with the difference, because collapsing the two is where the idea starts to sound cruel instead of liberating. Nobody has to say their abuse was good. Nobody has to say a senseless death served some cosmic purpose. What the thought experiment actually asks is something quieter and, in its own way, harder, given that this is the life you actually have, not the one you wish you'd had, not the one you might get instead, but this one, with its actual wounds and its actual gifts, inseparably woven together. Can you find your way to a relationship with it that isn't just endurance? Can you get somewhere past gritted teeth? Some people never get there, and it's worth saying honestly that Nietzsche himself doesn't promise everyone will, or should, force themselves to arrive at a yes on any particular timeline. The demon's question doesn't come with a deadline. It's not a task to be completed and checked off. It's closer to a compass than a finish line, a way of continually testing moment to moment, choice to choice, whether the life you're building is one you actually want, or one you're passively accumulating while telling yourself you'll deal with it later. And this is where the thought experiment stops being about your past and starts being about what you do next, which is really the more useful and more uncomfortable direction to take it. Because here's a version of the question that's harder to deflect than could you accept everything that already happened. Ask instead if this exact day, the one you're in the middle of right now, were going to repeat forever, not your whole life, just today, would you be doing anything differently? Most people, asked that question about an ordinary Tuesday, feel a small jolt of recognition because most ordinary Tuesdays are not lived as though they matter. They're lived as a bridge to Wednesday, as something to get through. You spend the day partially present, half attending to the conversation you're having while your mind runs ahead to the next thing, half tasting the meal while you look at your phone, half listening to the person across from you while some other part of you rehearses what you're going to say next. Ordinary days are, for most people, the days we live most carelessly, precisely because we assume there will be more of them, and because none of them individually seems to carry much weight. Eternal recurrence removes that assumption. If this day is going to happen again and again forever exactly as you live it, then the way you live it right now is not a rehearsal for some more important day later. It is, in a very real sense, the only day there is, repeating without end. The weight that Nietzsche said was the heaviest weight isn't really about the scale of your whole life. It's about the fact that it forces every single moment to matter, because every single moment is, under this thought experiment, eternal. This is where the idea stops being abstract philosophy and starts becoming something closer to a practice, a way of paying attention. Imagine actually trying to live this way, even briefly, even as an experiment rather than a metaphysical commitment. Imagine walking into your next ordinary conversation with the felt sense that this exact exchange, these exact words, this exact tone in your voice will recur forever. Would you say the same things? Would you say them the same way? Would you rush through it, distracted, the way you rush through so many conversations, eyes flicking to your phone, already halfway gone before the person in front of you has finished a sentence? Or would something in you slow down, pay closer attention, actually be there? Or imagine it applied to the low-grade dissatisfactions you've been quietly tolerating, the job you've told yourself you'll leave eventually, the relationship you've been meaning to either fix or end, the habit you keep promising yourself you'll break soon. Eternal recurrence has no patience for eventually and soon. It asks if this arrangement, this exact job, this exact relationship, this exact pattern repeats forever, unchanged, starting now, is that acceptable to you? And if the honest answer is no, the thought experiment doesn't offer comfort. It offers urgency. Because if the answer is no, then the excuse of eventually evaporates. There is no eventually in a loop. There is only what you do differently starting now, because now is the only place where the loop can be altered, not by escaping it, since within the thought experiment there is no escape, but by becoming, through your choices, someone who could say yes to the loop as it stands. This is, in a strange way, close to the opposite of fatalism, even though the idea sounds fatalistic on its surface. A true fatalist would say if everything is going to repeat exactly as it happened, then nothing you do matters because the outcome is fixed regardless. But that's not the spirit in which Nietzsche offers the thought experiment. He's not handing you a prophecy to submit to. He's handing you a mirror and asking what you see in order to provoke you into changing what you see. The recurrence isn't a prediction about a future you have no power over. It's a diagnostic tool aimed at your present, designed to strip away the comforting fiction that you have unlimited time to become who you want to be. You don't have unlimited time. You have this life, this specific one, and the thought experiment simply asks you to evaluate it as though it were the only one you'll ever get, which, of course, in the most literal sense, whether or not the universe loops, it actually is. There's a phrase Nietzsche used elsewhere, in a different but closely related context, that fits neatly alongside the eternal recurrence: become who you are. It sounds paradoxical on its face. How can you become something you already are? But the paradox dissolves once you understand what he meant by it. He didn't mean that your identity is fixed and waiting to be discovered, like a statue already complete inside a block of marble, needing only to be uncovered. He meant something closer to the opposite, that who you are is not a fact handed to you at birth, but an ongoing achievement built through the accumulated weight of your choices, your resistances, your affirmations and refusals, moment after moment, day after day. The eternal recurrence and become who you are, two versions of the same challenge approached from different angles. One asks you to look backward and evaluate whether the person your choices have built so far is someone you can affirm. The other asks you to look forward and take responsibility for continuing to build that person, choice by choice, with the understanding that every choice is, in effect, a vote for the kind of loop you're willing to live inside forever. It's worth pausing here to notice how far this has drifted from the popular, watered-down version of living like it's your last day, the kind of sentiment printed on inspirational posters, encouraging you to skydive, quit your job, tell someone you love them, because you might not get another chance. That version of urgency is actually the opposite of what Nietzsche is asking for, even though it can sound similar on the surface. Live like it's your last day, assume scarcity, this might be the only time, so extract maximum intensity from it before it's gone. Eternal recurrence assumes the opposite, not scarcity but repetition. Not this might never happen again, but this will happen again, exactly this way, forever. And that reframing changes the emotional logic completely. You're not being asked to squeeze the day for thrills before it disappears. You're being asked whether the day you're actually living, not a maximized thrill-seeking version of it, but the actual, often unremarkable texture of it, is one you'd be willing to inhabit endlessly. That's a much stranger and, in the end, much more demanding standard, because it doesn't let you cheat by imagining some heightened, special version of the day. It makes you answer for the day as it actually is. And this is, in a way, where the thought experiment becomes most personal, most impossible to hold at arm's length as an abstract philosophical puzzle. Because when you actually try to run this test against your own life, not against a hypothetical life, not against the life of someone you're reading about, but against the specific texture of your Tuesdays and your relationships and your habits and your fears, something in you either settles or recoils, and that reaction is information. It's telling you something true about where you actually stand in relation to your own existence, something that might be harder to access through ordinary reflection, because ordinary reflection lets you hedge. It lets you say, well, it's not perfect, but it's fine, and it'll get better. The eternal recurrence doesn't let you hedge. It asks for a yes or a no, forever, starting now. So try it, honestly, the way the demon would ask it, without the philosophical padding. Your job. Would you do it forever? Your closest relationship, exactly as it currently is, not as you hope it becomes, not as it was in its best months, but as it actually is right now, with its actual friction and its actual comfort. Would you choose it forever? The way you spend your evenings, the things you say to yourself when you fail at something, the way you treat the people who have the least power to hold you accountable, the way you talk to service workers, to strangers, to yourself when no one's listening. Forever. On repeat. Exactly as it is. If parts of that make you flinch, the flinch isn't the failure. The flinch is the beginning of the actual philosophical work, because it locates with unusual precision exactly where the gap is between the life you're passively living and the life you'd actually choose if choosing it meant choosing it forever. And once that gap is visible, it stops being abstract. It becomes something you can act on today, in the only moment you ever actually have any power over, which, under the logic of eternal recurrence, happens to also be the only moment there is, over and over, without end. It's worth noting, too, that Nietzsche did not intend the eternal recurrence as a solitary standard to be applied in isolation from everything else he wrote. It sits inside a larger body of thought about strength, self-overcoming, and what he called the will to power, his term for the fundamental drive he believed underlies all living things, not simply a drive to survive, but a drive to grow, to expand, to overcome resistance and become more than what one currently is. The eternal recurrence, in this context, functions almost like a filter for distinguishing between two very different responses to a difficult life. One response is what he called the spirit of gravity, or elsewhere, resentment, a kind of quiet resentment toward existence itself, a bitterness that blames the world, or fate, or other people for the fact that things didn't go the way one wanted, and that finds a kind of comfort in that blame, because blame is easier to live with than responsibility. The other response is affirmation, not denial of difficulty, not pretending things were easy, but a fundamental orientation toward one's own life that says, in effect, I built something out of this, and even the hard parts were mine, and I would not unmake myself by unmaking them. This distinction matters because it clarifies something that can otherwise get lost in the drama of the demon and the infinite loop. The eternal recurrence isn't really, at bottom, a claim about physics, and it isn't really a claim that you must love every individual thing that has ever happened to you. It's a way of asking whether your fundamental orientation toward your own existence is one of affirmation or one of resentment, whether you are, in Nietzsche's phrase, a yes-sayer or a no-sayer, and that orientation, unlike any individual event in your past, remains something you have some power over right now in how you choose to hold what has already happened and how you choose to act going forward. There's also a quieter, less discussed layer to the eternal recurrence that's worth bringing in here, because it changes how you might carry the idea once you leave this thought experiment behind and return to ordinary life. The recurrence, taken seriously, doesn't just ask you to evaluate your big decisions, your career, your relationships, the shape of your life as a whole. It asks you to take the smallest things seriously too, the things that seem too minor to matter, the way you greet a stranger, the tone you use with a person who can't do anything for you, the 5 minutes you spend fully present with someone instead of half present with your phone. If everything recurs, then nothing is too small to recur along with it. The unremarkable kindness you show someone in a checkout line becomes, under this thought experiment, an eternal event, something that will happen again and again forever exactly as you did it. That should change how it feels to do it. It should feel less like a forgettable interaction and more like a brushstroke in a painting you're going to be standing in front of forever. This is, in its own strange way, a kind of dignity the thought experiment grants to ordinary life that most philosophies don't bother to offer. Grand philosophies of meaning tend to locate significance in big, rare events: the wedding, the graduation, the career milestone, the moment of crisis that reveals character. Eternal recurrence refuses to let significance hide only in the rare and dramatic. It insists that the boring Tuesday matters exactly as much as the wedding, because the boring Tuesday, too, is eternal. There is no discount rate on ordinary time. Every hour you spend half present, scrolling, waiting for something better to start, is an hour you are choosing to spend that way forever. And every hour you spend actually attending to your life, actually tasting the food, actually listening to the person in front of you, actually noticing the specific quality of light in the room you're sitting in right now, is an hour reclaimed from the general drift of unlived time that swallows most people's days without their noticing. It's worth being honest, too, that this is an extraordinarily demanding standard to hold yourself to, and that living up to it perfectly, all the time, is probably not a realistic goal for anyone, including, by his own account in his letters, Nietzsche himself, who describes moments of despair, exhaustion, and something close to hopelessness that don't sound like the words of a man who had fully and permanently achieved Amor Fati as a settled, stable state. This matters because it means the eternal recurrence isn't a test you pass once and then move past. It's not a threshold you cross into permanent enlightenment. It's closer to a practice you return to, over and over, the way you'd return to a difficult piece of music you're trying to learn. Some days you play it well, other days you don't, and the discipline is in the returning, not in some final mastery that removes the need to return at all. This might be the most honest place to leave the idea, rather than pretending it resolves into something tidy. The eternal recurrence doesn't offer a solution to the problem of suffering, or a formula for guaranteed contentment, or even a stable endpoint you eventually arrive at and then get to rest in. What it offers is a question, repeated back to you as often as you're willing to ask it, that has the peculiar power to cut through the fog of eventually and someday and force you to look directly at the actual shape of your actual life right now and ask whether it's something you choose again, knowing it would never end and never change. And maybe the most important thing to notice sitting with that question is what it does to the future. Because if you take the thought experiment seriously, not as a metaphysical claim you need to resolve, but as a mirror you're willing to keep looking into, it stops functioning only as a judgment on the life you've already lived, and it starts functioning as an instruction for the life you haven't lived yet. Every day going forward is a day that, under this framework, you are choosing not just for today, but forever. Every choice, every conversation, every small act of attention or neglect becomes a vote for the kind of eternity you're willing to inhabit. That's an enormous amount of weight to place on an ordinary afternoon. It's also, strangely, a kind of freedom because it means the power to change the answer to the demon's question was never located only in the past, where it's fixed and unreachable. It's located here in whatever you do next, because whatever you do next is what the loop will be made of, going forward, forever. There's a particular kind of person the eternal recurrence seems to unsettle more than most, and it's worth naming because you might be that person, or you might love someone who is. It's the person who has organized their entire life around the promise of a future self. Not in the ordinary sense of having goals, everyone has goals, but in the deeper sense of having outsourced their present tense satisfaction entirely to some future version of themselves who will finally have it figured out. The future self who will finally have saved enough money to feel secure. The future self who will finally have the body they've been working toward and will finally like what they see in the mirror. The future self who will finally have resolved the thing with their parents, or finally left the job that's been quietly hollowing them out, or finally started the projects they've been talking about for 3 years. This is an extremely common way to live, and it's not obviously irrational, planning for the future, delaying gratification, working towards something better. These are not character flaws. But there's a subtle trap hidden inside this way of living, and eternal recurrence exposes it with unusual precision. If you are perpetually living for a future self who will finally arrive and finally be satisfied, you may never actually arrive there because the horizon keeps moving. The future self, once you reach them, discovers a new future self just past them, promising the same eventual satisfaction. And in the meantime, the actual present self, the one doing the waiting, has spent years, sometimes decades, treating their own life as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. Eternal recurrence collapses that structure entirely because it removes the future self from the equation. There is no future self in the loop. There is only the self you are right now repeating. If the version of you that exists today, with today's dissatisfactions, today's compromises, today's half-finished ambitions, is the version that recurs forever, not the improved version you're hoping to become, but this one, then the entire strategy of deferring satisfaction to some later point collapses under its own weight. You cannot defer within a loop. There is no later for the loop to defer to. There is only now, repeated. This is worth sitting with for longer than it's comfortable to, because most people's response when they first understand this implication is a kind of quiet panic. If I'm not allowed to wait until things get better, and this is what I've got, this half-finished, still becoming, still compromised version of a life, how can I possibly say yes to it? And this is exactly the point where the eternal recurrence stops being a thought experiment about accepting the past and starts being an argument about how you should be living the present, because the honest answer to that panic is not resignation. It's not, well, I guess I have to pretend I'm satisfied with something I'm not. The honest answer is closer to, then change what needs to change, now, today, because now is the only place the loop can be altered, and every day you spend waiting for the future self to arrive and fix things is a day added to the loop exactly as it currently stands, unresolved, waiting, dissatisfied. There's a useful contrast to draw here with a few other philosophical traditions that also grappled in their own ways with the problem of accepting a life you cannot fully control, because it helps clarify exactly what's distinctive about Nietzsche's version of the challenge. The ancient Stoics, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, arrived at something that sounds superficially similar to Amor Fati. They taught that a person should accept whatever happens to them, since almost nothing that happens is actually within their control, and that peace comes from focusing only on what is within one's power, which for the Stoics was essentially limited to one's own judgments, desires, and responses. Amor Fati even appears, in slightly different language, in Stoic writing that predates Nietzsche by centuries. But there's a crucial difference in tone and temperature between Stoic acceptance and Nietzschean affirmation. The Stoic ideal tends toward equanimity, a kind of calm, undisturbed evenness of temperament that treats both fortune and misfortune with the same measured indifference, because attachment to outcomes is, for the Stoics, the root of suffering. Nietzsche's affirmation is not calm in that way. It's not indifference. It's closer to passionate embrace, not I will not be disturbed by what happens to me, but I want this, all of it, with the same intensity I would want the thing I most desired. Where Stoicism asks you to lower the emotional stakes of your relationship to fate, Nietzsche asks you to raise them, to love your fate the way you'd love a person, fiercely and completely, rather than accept it the way you'd accept weather. There's also a useful contrast with a philosopher who came a couple of generations after Nietzsche and was deeply influenced by him. Albert Camus, writing in the 20th century, faced a version of the same underlying problem. How does a person live meaningfully in a universe that offers no guarantee of meaning, no cosmic justice, no promise that effort will be rewarded or suffering redeemed? And Camus reached for a different mythic figure to work through it. Rather than the demon and the eternal recurrence, Camus reached for Sisyphus, the figure from Greek myth condemned to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity, only to watch it roll back down each time, forever, an endless and pointless labor with no possibility of completion or reward. Camus's famous conclusion, that one must imagine Sisyphus happy, shares something important with Nietzsche's demon. Both are asking whether a person can find affirmation inside a structure of endless repetition that offers no escape and no ultimate payoff. But Camus's Sisyphus finds his meaning in the act of pushing itself, in his conscious ownership of an absurd task he cannot escape and refuses to be broken by. There's a kind of defiance in it, a scorn directed at the fate that tries to crush him, met with a stubborn refusal to be crushed. Nietzsche's demon asks for something warmer and, in some ways, harder to reach than defiance, not scorn met with endurance, but love. Not I will not let this break me, but I would not have it any other way. It's worth noticing, too, how different both of these are from another major response to the problem of suffering, one with a much older lineage, the response found in Buddhist thought, where the wheel of samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, is not something to be loved or defiantly endured, but something to be escaped entirely through the extinguishing of the craving and attachment that keep a person bound to the wheel in the first place. Where Nietzsche's demon offers eternal recurrence as a challenge to be met with affirmation, the Buddhist tradition treats endless recurrence as the fundamental problem to be solved, and liberation as release from the wheel altogether rather than a passionate embrace of it. These are, in a sense, three entirely different answers to a structurally similar question: what do you do when faced with an existence that repeats, or an existence that offers no final resolution? And setting them side by side makes it easier to see what's specific and strange about Nietzsche's proposal: not escape, not calm detachment, but love, aimed at the very thing that other traditions have tried to either flee or merely tolerate. This detour through other traditions isn't meant to settle which response is correct. That's a question worth sitting with on your own, and reasonable, thoughtful people land in very different places on it. But it does something useful. It shows that the eternal recurrence, whatever else it is not an isolated curiosity. It's Nietzsche's entry in a conversation that has occupied serious thinkers across very different cultures and centuries, all wrestling with some version of the same unbearable question: what do you do with a life or a universe that offers no guarantee that your suffering means anything, that your effort will be rewarded, that things will get better simply because you've endured long enough? Return for a moment to Nietzsche's own life because it clarifies something important about how demanding this idea actually is, and how much it cost the man who proposed it. By the time he wrote The Gay Science, he had already spent years cycling through debilitating physical illness that no doctor of his era could adequately diagnose or treat, migraines that could last for days, vomiting, near blindness that sometimes made reading and writing physically painful, digestive collapse that left him unable to keep food down for extended periods. He had resigned his university professorship in his mid-30s because his health made teaching impossible, and he spent much of the rest of his life as an itinerant, moving between boarding houses in Switzerland, Italy, and southern France, chasing climates that might ease his symptoms, almost always alone, almost always working in short bursts between bouts of illness that could incapacitate him for weeks. His books during his productive years sold in the hundreds, sometimes barely that. Thus spoke Zarathustra, the book that contains his fullest treatment of the eternal recurrence, and the figure of the Übermensch sold so poorly upon its early printings that Nietzsche at one point had to fund the publication of later parts himself, and he wrote, in letters to friends, about the isolation of producing work that almost no one seemed to understand or want. His romantic life was similarly marked by rejection and disappointment, most famously the proposal to Lou Salome that was refused, followed by a bitter and painful falling out that also damaged his relationship with his own sister, who took a hostile role in the aftermath. And his life ended after his final mental collapse in Turin in January 1889, an episode from which he never recovered, spending his last decade in a state of mental incapacitation, cared for first by his mother and then by his sister, unable to write, unable to fully understand the growing reputation his work was beginning to accumulate in the wider world, even as he himself was no longer capable of participating in it. None of this is meant to reduce Nietzsche's philosophy to a case study in personal suffering, as though the ideas can be explained away by pointing to the pain that produced them. That would be its own kind of dismissal, and Nietzsche would likely have found it both condescending and beside the point. But it is meant to make something clear when he asks whether you could say yes to your life, including its suffering. He is not asking this from a position of safety, theorizing about hardship he has not personally faced. He arrived at Amor Fati from inside chronic pain, professional obscurity, romantic rejection, and profound loneliness, and whatever else you make of his philosophy, it was not cheap for him to propose it. That doesn't make the idea correct, but it does mean the demand it makes of you is one its author was, by all available evidence, also trying and often failing to meet in his own life, which makes it less a lecture delivered from above and more a struggle he's inviting you into alongside him. It's worth turning the question back towards something more concrete now, because there's a risk in staying this long in the register of philosophy and biography, of letting the idea drift back into abstraction, the very thing the eternal recurrence is designed to resist. So bring it back down to the texture of an actual week, your actual week, and take a few of its specific pieces one at a time. Start with your mornings. Not the ideal morning you imagine you'll have once you finally fix your sleep schedule, or once you finally start that routine you keep meaning to start. The morning you actually have tomorrow, most likely, whatever shape it takes, whatever mood you wake up in, whatever the first hour of your day actually looks like. If that exact morning repeated every day, forever, unchanged, would you be at peace with it? Some part of the honest answer to that question might be yes. Maybe there's something in your morning routine you already treasure, some small ritual, a particular quiet, a particular cup of something warm, a particular window of solitude before the day's demands begin, and hearing that it would repeat forever might actually come as a relief rather than a threat. But some part of the honest answer might also be no. The scroll through your phone before your feet even hit the floor, the immediate flood of other people's demands and opinions before you've had a single unmediated thought of your own, the rush that begins before you've even had a chance to want anything. If that part surfaces, it's not a reason for despair. It's information. It's the eternal recurrence doing exactly what it's designed to do, locating, with precision, the specific place where your actual life and the life you choose have quietly drifted apart. Take your closest relationship next, whichever one that is for you, a partner, a parent, a close friend, a sibling. Not the relationship as it existed in its best month, and not the relationship as you hope it becomes once some unspoken tension finally gets addressed. The relationship as it actually stands right now, this week, with its specific rhythms of connection and its specific patterns of friction, the things you've stopped saying because saying them stops seeming worth the conflict, the affection that's still there but has maybe gotten quieter than it used to be, buried under logistics and habit. Forever, exactly as it is. Some of what surfaces here might be beautiful, a steadiness you've built together that you genuinely choose again without hesitation, an ease that took years to earn and that you'd be lucky to have on repeat for eternity. And some of what surfaces might be uncomfortable, the conversation you've been avoiding, the resentment that's calcified into something you no longer even notice as resentment because it's just become the background weather of the relationship. Again, the discomfort isn't the failure of the exercise. It's the exercise working. Take your relationship with your own body, since this is one of the places most people carry the most quiet, unexamined dissatisfaction day after day without ever really naming it as a philosophical question. The way you talk to yourself in the mirror. The running commentary of criticism that plays, for a lot of people, almost constantly, so constantly that it's stopped registering as a choice and started feeling like simply how things are. If that internal commentary repeated forever exactly as it currently runs, would you accept it? Would you want it? Or does something in you recoil at the thought of an eternity spent narrating your own body with the particular unkindness you've gotten so used to that you no longer notice it as unkindness at all? None of these questions are asked here to produce guilt. That would misunderstand the entire spirit of the thing, and it would be, in fact, precisely the opposite of what Nietzsche was after, since guilt is a backward-looking emotion, oriented toward punishing yourself for what already happened, while the eternal recurrence, for all its weight, is fundamentally oriented forward toward what you do starting now, in the only moment where anything can actually be changed. The purpose of running your actual life through this test piece by piece, morning by morning, relationship by relationship, is not to catalogue your failures. It's to locate, with more precision than ordinary reflection usually allows, exactly where the gap is between the life you're passively accumulating and the life you would actually choose, and then to treat that gap not as a verdict on your worth but as a map. A map showing you exactly where to put your attention next. There's one more piece of the idea worth bringing in before returning to the question in its original, unadorned form, because it addresses something that might have been sitting uneasily underneath everything said so far, a worry that's reasonable to have and worth answering directly rather than leaving unaddressed. The worry is this: doesn't all of this put an impossible amount of pressure on a person? If every ordinary moment carries the full weight of eternity, if every choice is a vote for a loop you'll be stuck inside forever, doesn't that turn ordinary life into an exhausting, humorless exercise in constant vigilance, where you can never simply relax, never simply have an unremarkable Tuesday without treating it as a referendum on your entire existence? It's a fair worry, and Nietzsche, for all his intensity, was not actually arguing for a life of constant, anxious self-monitoring. In fact, one of the qualities he prized most, and wrote about with real warmth, was lightness. He titled the book that contains the eternal recurrence "The Gay Science," gay in the older sense of the word, meaning joyful, light-spirited, capable of dancing rather than only marching. He distrusted heaviness for its own sake, distrusted moralizing, distrusted the kind of grim, joyless seriousness that mistakes suffering for depth. The eternal recurrence is meant to be the heaviest weight, yes, but the whole point of testing yourself against a weight that heavy is to discover whether you can meet it with lightness on the other side, not by ignoring the weight, but by passing through it and finding, waiting on the far side of taking your life fully seriously, something closer to genuine joy than the shallow, distracted comfort most people mistake for happiness. The alternative to living under constant anxious pressure isn't refusing to ask the question. It's asking the question honestly enough, often enough, that the answer starts to become yes more often than not, at which point the weight stops feeling like a burden and starts feeling like something closer to what he was actually after, a kind of fierce, clear-eyed gratitude for a life you have actually built, rather than one you were merely enduring. And this, in the end, is probably the most honest way to hold the entire thought experiment without either collapsing it into an easy self-help slogan or letting it curdle into something crushing. It is not a test you take once and pass permanently. It is not a philosophy that promises to remove suffering or resolve every regret or make peace with every wound instantly and completely. What it offers is something smaller and, in its own way, more useful, a question you can return to again and again, at any moment you choose, that has an almost unmatched power to cut through the fog of someday and eventually and force you to look, without flinching, at the actual shape of the actual life you are actually living right now, today, and to ask, honestly, whether it's something you would choose again. There's a concept that runs alongside the eternal recurrence in Nietzsche's work, mentioned earlier only in passing, that deserves more attention here because it's often misunderstood in ways that distort the whole picture. The Übermensch, sometimes translated as the Overman, sometimes as the Superman, though both translations carry connotations in English that Nietzsche almost certainly didn't intend. The word has, unfortunately, been dragged through some of the ugliest misappropriations in intellectual history, twisted by his sister, who controlled his literary estate after his collapse and edited his unpublished notes to align with her own nationalist and anti-Semitic views, and later seized upon by Nazi propagandists who distorted his philosophy into something it was never meant to be, something Nietzsche, who explicitly despised anti-Semitism and German nationalism in his actual writings and correspondence, would almost certainly have been horrified to see done in his name. It's worth saying this plainly because it matters for understanding the actual content of the idea rather than the caricature. The Übermensch is not a racial ideal, not a vision of biological superiority, not a justification for domination over others. It's something much more personal and, in the context of the eternal recurrence, much more directly relevant to the question of whether you can say yes to your life. The Übermensch, as Nietzsche actually describes the figure, is someone who has managed to create their own values rather than simply inheriting them unexamined from religion, tradition, or the unspoken assumptions of the culture around them. It's someone who has done the difficult work of figuring out for themselves what they actually believe is worth pursuing, worth suffering for, worth building a life around, rather than drifting through life on autopilot, absorbing values from parents, institutions, and social pressure without ever really examining whether those values are actually theirs. And crucially, the Übermensch is the figure capable of meeting the demon's question with a genuine, undivided yes, not because their life had been free of suffering, but because they have taken full ownership of their life, including its suffering, and shaped it as much as it's possible to shape anything into something they can stand behind completely. This matters for the eternal recurrence because it clarifies what becoming someone who can say yes actually requires. It's not simply a shift in attitude, a decision to think more positively about circumstances that remain otherwise unchanged. It requires the harder, slower work of actually examining your values, of asking, honestly, which parts of how you're living are things you've chosen because you've thought them through and believe in them, and which parts are things you're doing simply because they were handed to you, because everyone around you is doing them, because it never occurred to you to ask whether there was another way. A great deal of ordinary dissatisfaction, the low hum of quiet disappointment that so many people carry without ever quite naming it, comes from living according to values that were never really examined, chasing a version of success that was designed by someone else in another era for reasons that may no longer apply, measuring your life against a yardstick you never actually chose to pick up. Nietzsche's proposal, woven through both the eternal recurrence and the figure of the Übermensch, is that the way out of that low hum of dissatisfaction isn't to work harder at achieving the inherited goals or to distract yourself more skillfully from the fact that they don't quite fit. It's to do the harder, slower, more frightening work of asking what you would actually choose if choosing were entirely up to you, and then building your life, as much as circumstances allow, around that answer rather than around the answer you were handed. This connects back to the demon's question in a very direct way. If you're living according to values you never chose, pursuing goals that were handed to you rather than built by you, then of course the thought of that life repeating forever feels unbearable. You're not actually looking at your life when you imagine the repetition. You're looking at a costume someone else dressed you in, and no one wants to wear a costume forever. But if you've done the work of examining what you actually value, stripping away the inherited assumptions and the unexamined social pressure, and building a life, even an imperfect, still unfinished one, around what you found there, then the demon's question starts to land differently. You're not being asked to affirm a costume. You're being asked to affirm something you actually built, and there's a completely different quality to that kind of yes. This is worth sitting with in relation to a specific, common experience, the feeling of arriving at some marker of conventional success, the promotion, the relationship milestone, the size of house, the number in the bank account, and discovering that it doesn't feel the way you thought it would. That it's hollow, or at least far less satisfying than the years of striving toward it seemed to promise. This experience is common enough that it has become something of a cultural cliché, but it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing, because it's actually a very precise symptom of exactly the problem Nietzsche is pointing at. If the goal was never really yours, if it was inherited, absorbed from your culture or your family or your own anxious comparison to other people, then achieving it doesn't produce the satisfaction that achieving a genuinely chosen goal produces, because you were never actually building towards something you wanted. You were building towards something you were told to want, and no amount of achievement in that direction closes the gap between the life you're living and the life you'd actually choose, because that gap was never about achievement level in the first place. It was about ownership. This is, in its own way, one of the more hopeful threads inside an otherwise demanding and heavy idea, because it means the work of being able to say yes to your life isn't primarily about accumulating more success, more comfort, more achievement, more of whatever it is you've been taught to chase. It's about examination. About the slower, less glamorous work of figuring out what you actually value, separate from what you've been told to value, and then having the courage to build your life around that, even when it diverges from what everyone around you seems to be pursuing, even when it means giving up some of the conventional markers of success you'd previously assumed you needed. There's a specific kind of courage this requires that's worth naming directly, because it's easy to nod along with the idea of living your own values in the abstract while never actually confronting what it costs in practice. Examining your inherited values honestly often reveals that some of them don't survive the examination, that the career path you've been on wasn't actually chosen so much as defaulted into, that the relationship pattern you keep repeating isn't actually what you want but is instead a repetition of something modeled for you early in life that you never questioned, that the ambitions you've organized your 20s or 30s or 40s around were absorbed from a culture of comparison rather than built from genuine desire. Discovering this is disorienting, sometimes devastating, because it can mean acknowledging that years of effort were spent building toward a version of a life that was never actually going to satisfy you, no matter how successfully you built it. This is a genuinely painful discovery, and it's worth naming honestly rather than glossing over. The work of examining your values sometimes costs you the comfort of your previous certainty, and there's real grief in that. Grief for the version of your life you thought you were building, grief for the time that feels, in the moment of realization, like it was spent chasing the wrong thing. But, and this is where the eternal recurrence and the idea of self-examination loop back together in a way that's worth making explicit. Even this grief, even the years spent chasing an inherited rather than a chosen goal, are not necessarily years to be regretted or wished away entirely, because they are, in all likelihood, part of what made the eventual examination possible in the first place. You often cannot know that a goal isn't truly yours until you've spent real time pursuing it and felt, in your body, the hollowness of achieving it. The years spent chasing the wrong thing are not, in retrospect, wasted years in the way they might feel in the moment of realization. They are the very material out of which the capacity for honest self-examination was built. This is the interconnectedness mentioned earlier showing up again in a different form. You cannot simply excise the years you regret without also excising the wisdom that came from having lived through them, because the wisdom and the regret are woven from the same thread. It's worth pausing on a very ordinary, very common version of this pattern because it's likely to be more recognizable than any abstract description of it. Think of the years many people spend in their 20s chasing a version of achievement that was largely about external validation, the job title that would impress people at a dinner party, the relationship that looked good from the outside even if it didn't feel especially good from the inside, the apartment or the car or the vacation photos that were, if you're honest, at least partly about being seen rather than about genuine enjoyment. Almost everyone who eventually does the work of examining their own values looks back on some version of this period with a complicated mixture of embarrassment and tenderness. Embarrassment at how much energy went into performing a life rather than living one, and tenderness for the younger self who didn't yet know any other way to move through the world, who was doing the best they could with the tools and models they'd been given. The eternal recurrence applied to this period doesn't ask you to pretend those years were secretly wonderful or to insist that the performance was actually meaningful all along. It asks something more modest and more honest. Would you make the whole sequence, including the years of performing, including the eventual disillusionment, including the slow, hard-won clarity that came out the other side, knowing that making it would also make the person who eventually learned to want something more real? For most people, sitting with that question honestly, the answer starts to look less like simple regret and more like something closer to gratitude threaded through with a kind of rueful affection for who they used to be. This is, in the end, probably the most practically useful way to carry the eternal recurrence forward once you've spent enough time sitting inside its original, heavier framing, not as an eternal metaphysical sentence to be feared, and not as a comfortable slogan to be recited whenever things get difficult, but as a specific kind of attention you can bring deliberately to an ordinary day. A way of asking, in real time, as you move through your actual life, is this a moment I'm building on purpose, or a moment I'm merely passing through on the way to somewhere else? Is this a value I've chosen, or one I've inherited without examining it? Is this a relationship, a habit, a pattern of speech, a way of treating myself, that I would stand behind if I knew it would recur exactly this way forever, or is it something I've simply never stopped to look at closely enough to ask? None of this removes the weight of the original question. It shouldn't. The weight is the point. Nietzsche was explicit that this was meant to be the heaviest thing a person could carry, not because heaviness is good in itself, but because only a question with that much weight has the power to cut through the comfortable fictions most people use to avoid actually looking at their lives. A lighter question is easier to deflect. A lighter question lets you nod, agree in principle, and go back to exactly what you were doing before. The eternal recurrence, taken seriously, doesn't let you do that. It sits there, demanding an answer, refusing to let eventually or someday or it'll get better function as an actual response, because in the loop, there is no eventually. There is only what you do now, which becomes, by the logic of the thought experiment, what you will always have done, forever. There's an objection worth addressing directly before going any further, because it's probably already occurred to you, and it deserves a real answer rather than a dodge. If everything is going to recur exactly as it happened, the same causes producing the same effects, the same choices following inevitably from the same prior conditions, doesn't that mean you never actually had a choice in the first place? Doesn't the eternal recurrence, taken as a literal cosmological claim, collapse into a kind of total determinism, where the demon's question about how you respond is itself just another fixed link in the chain, already determined, already decided, with the illusion of deliberation dressed over the top of an outcome that was never actually in doubt? This is a serious philosophical problem, and it's worth being honest that Nietzsche doesn't fully resolve it. Reasonable interpreters of his work disagree about exactly how he intended the eternal recurrence to relate to questions of free will, and some of the tension may simply be a real, unresolved tension in his thought rather than a puzzle with a tidy solution waiting to be found. But there's a useful way of holding this that keeps the idea usable without pretending the difficulty away. It goes something like this: even within a fully determined loop, there is still a meaningful difference between the version of you who meets each moment with resentment, grinding your teeth against a fate you experienced as imposed from outside, and the version of you who meets each moment with affirmation, experiencing that same fate as something you would have chosen. The events might be identical in both cases. The inner relationship to those events is not. And that inner relationship, whether you experience your life as something happening to you or as something you are actively living, is not a small, cosmetic difference. It's arguably the entire difference between a life of quiet suffering and a life of something closer to freedom, even if freedom, in the deepest metaphysical sense, turns out to be more complicated or more constrained than we'd like to believe. Put differently, the practical usefulness of the eternal recurrence doesn't actually depend on resolving the free will question first. Whether or not your choices are, at the deepest level, fully determined by prior causes stretching back before your birth, you still experience your life moment to moment as a series of decisions that feel like they're yours to make. And within that lived experience, which is, after all, the only place any of us ever actually live, the question of whether you can say yes to your life remains fully meaningful, fully urgent, regardless of what turns out to be true at the level of cosmic mechanics. The demon isn't really asking you to solve metaphysics before you answer. The demon is asking you, right now, inside your actual felt experience of being alive, whether you can meet what's in front of you with a yes. It might help at this point to walk through a few more specific, concrete scenes, because the idea tends to land harder in specifics than in generalities, and there are pieces of the original prompt worth returning to directly: the conversations, the mistakes, the heartbreak, the boring Tuesdays, the moments of unexpected happiness, each of which deserves its own moment of attention rather than being folded into a single abstract category called your life. Take a conversation, not a momentous one, just an ordinary one, the kind you have dozens of every week without remembering most of them by the following morning. A quick exchange with a coworker about nothing in particular. A phone call with a parent that covers the weather, a minor complaint about traffic, an update on someone you both know, nothing that feels, in the moment, like it matters. Under the logic of eternal recurrence, that conversation is not a throwaway. It is, in fact, exactly as eternal as the conversation where you said "I love you" for the first time, or the conversation where you finally told someone the truth you'd been avoiding for years. Every word in it will recur forever, exactly as spoken. This doesn't mean every ordinary conversation needs to be transformed into something weighty and self-conscious that would be its own kind of failure, trading one kind of unlived life for another, more anxious kind. But it does mean something worth carrying quietly into the next unremarkable exchange you have, that the way you show up for it, whether you're actually listening or just waiting for your turn to talk, whether there's real warmth in your voice or just the automatic performance of warmth, is not beneath the dignity of philosophical attention. It is, under this framework, precisely where philosophical attention belongs. Take a mistake, a real one, something you did that hurt someone or hurt yourself, something you'd take back if taking things back were possible. The eternal recurrence doesn't ask you to decide the mistake was actually fine, or that it didn't really cause the harm it caused, or that everyone involved should simply get over it because it was somehow secretly necessary. It asks something narrower and, in its way, more bearable, whether you can hold that mistake as part of the total fabric of a self you're willing to go on being, rather than as a permanent verdict that disqualifies you from ever affirming anything again. There's a difference between I did something wrong and I am working to repair what can be repaired and become someone less likely to do it again, and I did something wrong and therefore I am fundamentally disqualified from ever saying yes to my own existence. The first is accountability. The second is a kind of self-punishment dressed up as humility, and it's worth noticing that Nietzsche, of all philosophers, had very little patience for that particular disguise. He wrote extensively in other work about what he saw as the danger of a moral framework built primarily around guilt and self-flagellation, arguing that it tends to produce not better people but smaller, more resentful ones, people who mistake suffering for virtue. Affirming your life, mistakes included, is not the same as excusing the mistakes. It's refusing to let them be the only thing you're allowed to see when you look at the whole of who you've become. Take heartbreak, since it's specifically named in the question this whole piece is built around, and since it's probably one of the sharper tests the eternal recurrence can be run against. Think of a heartbreak you've actually lived through, not a hypothetical one, an actual one, with an actual name attached to it if you're willing to let yourself remember it that specifically. The version of you that existed before it, who didn't yet know what that particular loss would feel like. The version of you in the immediate aftermath, when it seemed impossible that the pain would ever become bearable. And the version of you now, on the other side of it, however far on the other side of it you currently are. Would you erase it? Not soften it, not shorten it, not skip past the worst nights of it, actually erase it so that it never happened at all, so that the relationship simply continued or never began or ended some other, gentler way. For a lot of people, sitting honestly with that question produces a surprising answer, or at least a more complicated one than they expected walking in. Because heartbreak, for almost everyone who's lived through a serious one, turns out to be one of the more efficient teachers of what actually matters to them, what they need in a relationship that they didn't know they needed until they didn't have it anymore, what they're capable of surviving, what tenderness they're capable of extending to themselves once the version of them that got left or got hurt has had time to heal. This doesn't mean heartbreak is secretly good, or that it should be sought out, or that the person who caused it should be let off some hook they deserve to remain on. It means that the specific shape of who you are now, including whatever wisdom, whatever hard-won steadiness, whatever deepened capacity for real intimacy you may have built since, is not fully separable from having lived through that particular loss. Erase the heartbreak, and you don't just erase the pain. You erase whatever grew in the space the pain carved out, and it's worth asking, honestly, whether you'd actually want to make that trade once you see the whole shape of what's being asked. And take, finally, the boring Tuesday, because it's worth ending this particular stretch of examples on the least dramatic one, the one that's easiest to overlook and probably the most common texture of most actual lives. A Tuesday with nothing remarkable in it. No heartbreak, no mistake worth naming, no conversation you'll remember by Thursday. Just the ordinary weight of an ordinary day, waking up, going through motions that have become so familiar they barely register as choices anymore, moving from task to task without much reflection, going to bed roughly as tired as you were the night before, having accomplished roughly what you expected to accomplish and felt roughly what you expected to feel. This is, statistically, most of what a human life is actually made of. Not the heartbreaks, not the mistakes, not even the ordinary conversations that at least involve another person, just the vast, undifferentiated middle ground of days that don't ask to be remembered and mostly aren't. This is where the eternal recurrence does some of its quietest and, arguably, most important work, because it refuses to let this vast, undifferentiated middle ground go unexamined. If you can say yes to your heartbreaks because of what grew out of them, and yes to your mistakes because of what you learned from them, but you can't honestly say yes to your ordinary Tuesdays if the bulk of your actual life, the part that isn't dramatic enough to justify itself through growth or lesson or narrative arc, is something you genuinely rather not repeat, then something in the daily texture of how you're living deserves attention that it's probably not currently getting, precisely because it's not dramatic enough to draw your attention on its own. The heartbreaks and mistakes announce themselves. They demand to be dealt with. The boring Tuesdays don't demand anything. They just accumulate silently, one after another, and it's entirely possible to spend years, even decades, letting them accumulate without ever once asking whether you'd actually choose to have them back. That may, in the end, be the single most useful thing to take from the entire thought experiment, more useful even than the demand to affirm your heartbreaks or your mistakes, the invitation to stop treating your ordinary days as filler, as the unremarkable connective tissue between the moments that supposedly count. Under the logic of eternal recurrence, there is no connective tissue. There is no filler. Every day is load-bearing. Every day is, in its own way, the whole of your life, happening once more, forever. And the demon isn't only waiting in your loneliest hour to ask about the big things, the relationships, the losses, the defining choices. It's just as content to ask about the Tuesday you're in the middle of right now. There's one last thread worth pulling before letting the question stand on its own, because it addresses something that tends to surface once a person has actually sat with the eternal recurrence long enough to feel its full weight rather than just its concept, a kind of vertigo that comes from realizing how much of your life you've spent not really deciding anything, just drifting along a current set in motion by other people's expectations or by the simple momentum of habit. It can start to feel, once you see it clearly, like an accusation, like the demon isn't really offering a test so much as delivering a verdict you already suspect is unflattering. And it's worth saying directly that this is not the spirit in which the idea is most useful to carry. Nietzsche was not, whatever his reputation suggests, primarily interested in making people feel small or exposed. He was interested in whether a person could become large enough, strong enough, honest enough, awake enough to meet their own existence without flinching. The eternal recurrence is demanding, but demanding is not the same as punitive. A demanding teacher is not necessarily a cruel one. The demon's question is asked in the original passage, in your loneliest hour, not in a courtroom, not in front of a jury of everyone who's ever judged you, but alone, in the quiet, where the only verdict that matters is the one you're honest enough to give yourself. There's something almost tender in that framing, once you notice it. The demon isn't trying to catch you out. It's offering you the rare, uncomfortable gift of being asked directly and without the usual social padding what you actually think of the life you're living, a question almost no one else in your life will ever ask you this plainly, because it's not really their place to, and because most of us spend most of our time protecting each other and ourselves from having to answer it. So if the honest answer, run against your actual life today, comes back as something other than a clean yes, and for most people, most of the time, it probably will, because a clean, uncomplicated yes to everything is a rare and perhaps not even fully desirable state, closer to an asymptote you move toward than a destination you arrive at and stay in permanently. That's not a failure of the exercise, and it's not a verdict on your worth as a person. It's simply where you are right now, honestly located, which is a great deal more useful than where you'd be if you never asked the question at all and simply continued drifting, unexamined, through days that were quietly accumulating into a shape you hadn't actually chosen. What happens next is the only part of this that was ever really within your control, not the demon's question, which you can't uninvite once you've heard it clearly. Not the past, which is fixed regardless of what any thought experiment asks of you, just the next moment, and the one after that, and the slow, unglamorous work of building a life, choice by choice, day by day, that you could eventually stand in front of and mean it when you say yes. So here is the question again, stripped of everything except its original weight. So here is the question again, stripped of everything except its original weight, the way the demon would ask it in your loneliest hour, when there's no one else in the room and nothing to distract you from having to actually answer this life, not the one you're planning, not the one you'll get around to once things change, but the one you are living right now, today, in this exact configuration of relationships and habits and fears and small unnoticed kindnesses and unresolved regrets, if it had to happen again, exactly as it is, forever, without end, without escape, without a better draft waiting somewhere down the line. Would you say yes?